A neck snaps in the dark alley, dry, clean, then silence, only rain dripping onto the concrete. Some cities sleep when night falls. Chicago is not one of them. 51 floors up, a man stands behind a wall of glass, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. He has ordered the deaths of more men than he can count. But the thing that makes his hand tremble tonight is a single white packet of sugar set beside a cup of black coffee. Lower the lens. Down into the alley's sickly yellow light. 2 large men lie motionless. Between them, a small woman wipes blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. Calm. Like she's brushing off rain, she's wearing a waitress's apron. And no one knows who she really is. Above her, the scrape of a boot on rusted iron. Someone just dropped down behind her. The diner smelled of scorched filter coffee and old bleach and grease that had soaked so deep into the tazlil it had become part of the building's bones. To most men, it smelled like a place you'd never bring a date. To Dutch Marlowe, 42 years old and tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, it smelled like the closest thing he had to peace. He sat in the corner booth, always the corner, always the seat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. The red vinyl was split down the middle. Held together with duct tape, gone gray with age, it scratched the back of his charcoal suit every time he shifted. He didn't mind. Discomfort kept a man honest. Outside, Chicago was a smear of rain and headlights. 2:14 in the morning. A Tuesday, the only other souls in the place were a trucker face-down over a plate of cold eggs, and an old man by the window, nursing a coffee he couldn't afford to refill, and her name tag said Wren. Dutch took a slow pull from his cigarette. Nobody smoked in diners anymore. Except him. The manager had stopped saying anything weeks ago. Right around the time a $100 bill started appearing under his saucer every night. Money buys a lot of things. Silence is the cheapest one on the menu. She came out from behind the swinging kitchen doors carrying a plastic tub of dirty mugs. And Dutch watched her the way he watched everything. Carefully, without seeming to. She looked wrung out. Blonde hair pulled back in a knot that had lost the fight hours ago, strands stuck to a forehead damp with kitchen heat. Her uniform hung off her like it had been bought for a bigger woman, frayed hem. Pockets sagging with a notepad and a fistful of loose change. She set the tub down, started loading the machine. Her hands moved like they'd done it 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. Dutch exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke and let his eyes drop to her knuckles, bruised. Yellow going into purple. Fading now, but there he'd noticed them 3 days ago. And here's the thing about Dutch Marlowe. He read people for a living. He'd built an empire on it. On knowing what a man would do before the man himself knew. Fear, greed, love, cowardice. He could smell all of it across a crowded room. It had kept him alive for 20 years in a business where most men didn't see 30. But he couldn't read her. She was a locked door in a building he owned. He didn't know her last name. Didn't know where she slept. Didn't know a single true thing about her. He knew only that for the last month, after the ledgers and the threats and the occasional blood he had to scrub from under his own fingernails, he came here, to this dying diner. To watch a stranger pour coffee, because in Dutch's world, every human being was one of 2 things. A predator or something a predator feeds on. That was the whole map. There was no third country, except her. She was the third country. She looked at him and didn't see the Marlowe name. Didn't see the money or the reputation or the quiet, patient violence that followed him like a second shadow. She saw a man who ordered black coffee and tipped like an idiot. She gave him the same flat, exhausted courtesy she gave the sleeping trucker and the broke old man by the window. It was, Dutch realized one night with a strange ache in his chest, the most honest relationship he had left, which should have told him something. It didn't. Not yet. There was another reason he watched her. One he didn't say out loud. Not to Sal. Not to himself most nights. A thing he kept locked in a drawer at the back of his skull. The drawer had teeth. He'd learned not to open it. But something about the way Wren carried herself pried that drawer open a crack. Something about the way she kept going when going was clearly the harder choice. And Dutch Marlowe, who felt almost nothing anymore, felt that, so he came back. Night after night. Like a man visiting a grave he wasn't supposed to have. The bell over the door chimed. 2 of them came in loud, stumbling, smelling of cheap beer and cheaper weed. Young. The kind of young that thinks the world was built as its personal playground. One had a shaved head and a leather jacket 2 sizes too big for the man inside it. The other trailed behind, giggling at nothing. They dropped into a booth near the middle, and started slapping the table like it owed them money. Hey. Service? The shaved one. Loud. Burgers over here. Sometime tonight, sweetheart. Ren wiped her hands on her apron, picked up 2 menus, walked over with a face like a shut door. What can I get you? Not a question. A transaction. A smile for starters. The shaved one grinned and reached out and wrapped his fingers around her wrist. Dutch jaw tightened. He didn't move. That surprised even him. Because there was a gun under his left arm, custom grip, warm from his body heat. And there was a very old and very familiar cold thing waking up in his blood. The thing that liked to correct imbalances. The thing that had made him what he was. 20 feet, 2 shots. Sal could have the mess cleaned before the coffee finished dripping. He shifted his weight. His hinge drifted toward his lapel, but then Ren moved small. So small most men would have missed it. She dropped her center of gravity, planted her feet, and her freshman slid not fast, not obvious to rest 2 fingers against the heavy glass ketchup bottle on the table. She didn't grip it, she just touched it. The way you touch a thing you already know exactly how you're going to use. Let go, quiet. Not loud, not shaking. Just tired, come on, honey. Painfully, he tugged. Tried to reel her in. Dutch's fingers found the edge of his jacket, and something in Ren's eyes must have finally cut through the beer. Because the kid blinked, looked at her, really looked, at the cold thing sitting behind her face, and slowly, 1 finger at a time, he let go. He laughed, too high, too fast. The laugh of a man who just realized he'd been standing on a frozen lake in April, whatever. Place smells like a dumpster, anyway. Let's go. They shoved out of the booth, banged through the door. The bell rang like it was glad to see them leave. Ren stood there a second. She rubbed her wrist, straightened the salt and pepper, squared the menus, walked back behind the counter like a woman whose only complaint was the interruption to her routine. She didn't look scared. She didn't look relieved. She looked annoyed. And Dutch Marlowe, master reader of men, sat in his cracked vinyl booth with his cold coffee and felt the floor of everything he thought he knew shift half an inch to the left. Because she hadn't been afraid. Not for a heartbeat. She had been ready to open that kid's skull with a ketchup bottle and go back to loading the dishwasher. He stubbed out his cigarette. Slow. Thoughtful. He looked at her hands again. At those bruised knuckles, he'd assumed a boyfriend. Some deadbeat who liked to swing. It was a common enough story. The most common story there was. But watching her wipe down the counter with the calm of a woman who'd just decided against violence rather than survived it. A colder thought bloomed in the back of his mind. Those weren't a victim's hands. Those were something else. He left 300 that night. He didn't know why. He told himself it was because she'd earned it, dealing with drunks. But that wasn't it. It was because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd walked into a room and left it not understanding a single thing. And Dutch Marlowe had spent his whole life making sure that never happened. Sleep didn't come that night. It rarely did. He stood at the glass wall of his penthouse and watched the city breathe below him. 51 floors of nothing between him and the street. He owned 3 of those floors. He owned pieces of the men who owned the rest. And still the place echoed. There was a photograph in his desk drawer he hadn't looked at in 6 years. He didn't look at it now either. He just knew it was there. He poured a bourbon. Didn't drink it. The waitress had ready hands, the kind of hands you don't get from bad luck. You get them from training, from choosing. And a woman like that, working nights, in a dump like that, under a name that didn't fit her. Every instinct he had, the ones that had kept him breathing this long, sat up and started paying attention. He should have walked away. He didn't. That was the first mistake. The first of many. The next night, the diner was nearly empty. The trucker gone, the old man gone, just the neon and the rain and the woman with the bruised hands. Dutch drank 2 cups he didn't want just to buy the time to watch her. And near 2 in the morning, the sign out front buzzed once and died. Closing. He was already in his car when she came out. He'd sent Sal home hours ago. Told him he had a woman. Sal, who'd been driving Dutch for a dozen years, had raised 1 eyebrow the exact height that meant he knew that was a lie, and said nothing. Because that was the job. Knowing when to say nothing, now Dutch sat behind the wheel of a plain black sedan across the street. No armor, no plates that meant anything. A ghost car for a man who wanted for one night to not exist. Ren came out in an oversized army jacket that swallowed her whole, pulled the collar up against the cold, locked the door, started walking west, And this is the part where a smarter man goes home. Dutch put the car in drive. He rolled forward with the lights off, tires whispering through the puddles, the heavy sedan gliding through the dark like something that hunts in deep water. What are you doing? The thought hit him hard and mean. He had a shipment coming into the docks tomorrow. He had the Sasagaloff problem breathing down the back as pushing in from the north side, testing his edges, looking for soft spots. He had a war 3 phone calls away from starting, and here he was, 42 years old. Enough blood behind him to fill the lake, creeping down a wet street at 2 in the morning. Following a waitress, it was pathetic. It was dangerous. He couldn't turn the wheel. Because Ren didn't walk like a tired woman going home. That's what stopped him. That's what kept his hands on the wheel and his foot off the brake. She walked like a sentry head up. No phone, no dawdling. Her eyes moved constantly the parked cars, the black mouths of the alleys, the roof lines, not the twitchy fear of a woman alone in a bad part of town. Something slower, colder, a methodical sweep. Clear left, clear right, clear high. Dutch had seen soldiers walk like that. He had men who walked like that. He had never seen a waitress do it. She turned right on Kedzie, away from the apartments, toward the industrial belt where the street lights were shattered or dead, and the buildings were rusted out corpses of factories that had died when the work went overseas. The kind of place where the police put your call at the bottom of the pile and hoped it resolved itself. Dutch stopped the car. He couldn't follow down those narrow streets in the sedan without lighting himself up like a Christmas tree. So he did the second stupid thing that night. He killed the engine, got out, the cold hit him, wet asphalt and rot. He flipped up the collar of his coat, checked the weight of the gun under his arm out of habit older than his marriage had been. And he walked. His shoes made no sound. 20 years of walking into rooms where the wrong footstep got you killed had taught him how to move like a roomer. He kept to the deep shadow along the brick, tracking the small figure in the army jacket 50 yards ahead. She turned into an alley, and Dutch's pulse ticked up because he knew this district. He knew that alley. It was a dead end, backed up against the old rail yard. Nothing down there but chain link and feral cats and the ghosts of men who used to have jobs. A drug thing, he thought, and felt something curdle in his chest that took him a second to name. Disappointment. So that was it. She was using, or running for a crew. It explained the exhaustion, the strange calm, the bruised hands. She was just another junkie feeding a habit in the dark. And he was just a fool who'd built a fairy tale around a coffee pot. He reached the alley mouth, pressed his back to the wet brick, leaned out. Ren stood 30 feet down, lit by one caged bulb over a loading dock, the light the sick yellow of an older bruise. She wasn't moving, hands jammed in her pockets, staring at the wall. Nobody else sat there, no dealer, no contact. Nothing. Then he heard it. Not from her, from above, the scrape of a boot on rusted iron, and 2 men dropped off the fire escape ladder, landing heavy on the pavement behind her. Dutch knew them on sight. Not the faces, the shape. The square jaws, the cheap long coats, the way they filled space like men who'd been taught to. Russian muscle Sokolov's men. Dutch's hand went into his coat. Fingers closed on cold, textured grip. Thumb on the safety. If they touch her, I put them both down. It wasn't a plan. It was a reflex, cold and total and immediate, and it came from a place he didn't examine too closely. The bigger Russian stepped up. Neck like a fire hydrant, thick with scar tissue. You bring it, thick accent. A voice like gravel in a bucket. Ren didn't turn around. I said I would, and Dutch nearly dropped his gun, because her voice was wrong. The tired, flat waitress rasp was gone. What came out instead was cold, hollow, a voice from the bottom of a very deep and very dry well. It was a voice that had left something important behind a long time ago and had learned to work fine without it. Turn around, the second Russian snapped. He pulled a revolver from his waistband. Dutch clicked his safety off, stepped out from the wall, raised his arm, lined the front sight on the base of the second Russian's skull. Took a breath and never fired, because it happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Ren turned, except she didn't just turn. She detonated. The slouching, worn-down waitress simply ceased to exist, and in her place was something that moved like water poured downhill. She didn't reach for a gun. She didn't scream. As she spun, her left hand came out of the jacket pocket, and something small and metal caught the yellow light. She closed the distance before the big Russian's brain finished sending the signal to his hands ducked under his reaching arm, grabbed his collar, drove her knee up into his face with a sound like a dry branch snapping in a closed room. His head snapped down. His nose folded flat. She wasn't done. While he reeled, blind and choking, her left hand punched forward. The metal flash was a curved little blade, ugly and efficient, and she drove it up under his jaw and twisted and ripped it out sideways. The pavement went dark and wet. He never got the chance to scream. He just went down. Dutch froze. Finger on the trigger, mind refusing to process the sheer, casual completeness of what he was watching. The second Russian stumbled back, eyes blown wide, raised the revolver in shaking hands. Wren didn't pause to admire her work. She hooked her boot behind the falling man's knee, dragged the collapsing body up, used the dead weight as a shield. The revolver went off. Bang. The round slammed into the dying man's chest and jerked him backward. She stayed low, tucked behind the corpse, and when the second Russian thumbed the hammer for another shot, she came out from behind the body and threw something. Dutch squinted through the dark. A flashlight. Heavy, industrial. It caught the man square in the forehead with a thud that snapped his head back and threw his aim wide. The second shot sparked off the brick, high above. Then she was on him. She slapped the revolver's cylinder sideways, jamming it dead with the heel of her hand, stepped inside his reach, wrapped an arm around his neck, dropped her hips, and used his own falling weight to wrench her entire the body around. A dry, hollow snap, the second Russian went limp. Dropped like a sack of wet sand. His neck at an angle necks don't go. Silence poured back into the alley, broken only by the rain and the wet failing breath of the first man on the ground. Dutch stood 30 feet away, gun raised. Completely forgotten in his own hand, his breathing was shallow. A cold sweat crawled along his hairline. He had seen violence. He had done violence. He'd watched men beaten to death in warehouses and shot to pieces across dinner tables. He was not a squeamish man. He was not a soft man. But this was different. This wasn't a mob hit. This wasn't rage or business or fear. This was surgery. This was military. This was the clean, soulless application of lethal force by something that stood at the top of the food chain and knew it. Wren stood over the two bodies, breathing hard now. She reached up and wiped a streak of blood off her cheek with the back of her sleeve. Almost bored, like a woman brushing off rain, she knelt beside the first man, the one gone still, dug through his coat, came out with something small and black, a flash drive maybe, a key fob. Dutch couldn't tell from here. She slipped it into her pocket. Then she wiped the curved blade on the dead man's coat, folded it, pocketed it, kicked the fallen revolver into a storm drain, and turned back toward the mouth of the alley, toward Dutch. He melted into the shadow, held his breath, held everything, because if she saw him, he knew with a certainty that surprised him that they would have to fight. And Dutch Marlowe, a very good shot and a very hard man, looked at the two corpses cooling on the gravel and was not at all sure he'd win. She walked right past him, close enough that he could smell the copper coming off her clothes, mixed with the cheap diner soap on her hands. Her eyes were dead ahead, empty. She never turned her head. She disappeared into the rain. Dutch lowered the gun. His hand was shaking. He watched it shake like it belonged to another man. He'd come here looking for a victim. He'd come here looking for someone to save. Someone to be, for 1 hour a night, a man who protected instead of a man who took. Instead, he'd found a predator that made him look like a house cat, and God help him. He had never in his whole gray life been more interested in anything. The glass sat on his mahogany desk, sealed inside a clear evidence bag, an ordinary diner water glass, clouded from a decade in an industrial washer, chipped at the heavy base. Nothing. She'd set it down 2 nights later when she went to grab a fresh pot. Dutch had slid it into his coat and walked out into the rain like a thief, which, he supposed, is exactly what he was. You look like death, boss. Ozzy never knocked. He was the only man alive who could get away with it. Late 20s, skin the color of a man who hadn't seen the sun since middle school, drowning in an oversized hoodie. He was the Marlowe family's ghost in the machine. He could erase a man's entire financial life in the time it took to microwave a burrito, or find a rat hiding 3 states deep in a federal safe house. Dutch nudged the bag across the polished wood. Everything you can pull off this, prints. DNA. I want to know who held this glass. Ozzy picked it up, squinted at the grease and water spots. Who are we hunting? Boss, 2 hours. Ozzy vanished back through the heavy oak doors. By noon, the underworld was buzzing. Sal came in with his heavy shoulders bunched tight. A dozen years of driving Dutch through the worst nights of both their lives, and Dutch could read the man's mood by the set of his neck. "Sokolov's tearing up the north side," Sal said, voice a low rumble. Two of his heavy hitters turned up in an alley off Kezi. One had his neck snapped clean. The other, Sal paused. The other was cut open. Bad, who's Sokolov blaming, everybody? Us, the outfit. The Poles. But here's the thing. Sal rubbed a hand over his scalp. My guy in the district says the scene was a lake of blood and not one useful print. It was a professional, Dutch. Tell our people to keep their heads down. Double the guns on tonight's shipment. Let Sokolov drown in his own paranoia. Sal nodded. Left, the desk phone buzzed. The secure line. Ozzy's basement. Dutch hit the speaker. Talk, and Ozzy's voice came through, and it was wrong. Ozzy was never rattled. Ozzy treated federal databases like a video game. Right now he sounded like a man who'd seen a shadow move on its own. Where'd you get the glass? The name, Ozzy, that's the thing. There is no name, rapid typing. Then it stopped. I pulled a perfect right thumbprint. Ran it local. Nothing. Statewide. Nothing. I bounced it through the federal criminal database. And then through a back door I've got into a defense server that I am not supposed to have. And it threw a fatal error. A breath. It didn't say no match, Dutch. It locked me out. A high-level scrub program tripped the second I fed in the ridges. Whatever server holds her file is walled off behind military-grade encryption. The kind of ice that alphabet agencies use to bury their cleaners so deep they were never born. Dutch leaned forward. Rested both hands flat on the desk. I chased the identity she's wearing. Ozzy went on, quieter now. The name on her apron. It traces to a social security number issued to a stillborn baby in Ohio 30-some years ago. The apartment she rents on the west side paid in cash, 6 months up front, leased through a shell company that dead ends in a bank that folded in the Caymans a decade back. She doesn't exist, Dutch. She's a phantom. Silence on the line. Wipe the search, Dutch said finally. Burn the glass. Forget you ran the print. Forget, I asked. He hung up before Ozzy could argue. He walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cool glass. 51 floors down, the city crawled along, oblivious. He'd spent a month pitying her, tipping her, building a small warm lie about a lost girl and a man who could have saved her. And the whole time, he thought about the bruised knuckles again. He understood them now. They weren't from a boyfriend. They were conditioning. The slow, deliberate, patient breaking of bone against a heavy bag, over and over for years, until the calcium built up and the hands went hard as tool steel. She wasn't hiding from the world. She was waiting for something in it. He went back 7 nights later. He told himself he wouldn't. He told himself a lot of things. But at 1 a.m, he was in the plain sedan again, and by 1:15 he was in the corner booth, and the diner smelled exactly the same. Bleach. Burnt coffee. Grease. The place was empty. Just the hum of the neon and the rain drumming on the glass. Wren came out of the kitchen, and Dutch watched her, truly watched her now, stripped of the fairy tale. The walk that wasn't a tired slouch but a low, balanced, silent glide. The baggy uniform that wasn't bad tailoring but a way to break up the lines of a body, hide the lean muscle, hide whatever she kept tucked against the small of her back. She picked up the pot and a mug and came to his table. Black. No sugar, she poured. Dutch didn't look at the coffee. He looked at her hands. Rough night? His voice was level, perfectly, deliberately level. Wren stopped pouring, set the pot down, pulled a rag from her apron and wiped a drop of coffee that wasn't there. They're all rough. It's a rough city. Dutch leaned back, let the tired tipper fall away. Let a little of the other thing, the cold, patient thing that men in 3 states were afraid of leak into the space between them. Read the paper this morning. 2 men found dead. Alley off Kezi, Russians. 1 with a broken neck. 1 taken apart. Wren didn't flinch. She kept wiping the table in slow mechanical circles. People shouldn't play in dark alleys. These weren't people who play. Dutch lowered his voice. They were Sokolov's enforcers. Somebody took them apart in seconds. That takes a very particular education. That takes a predator. Wren stopped wiping. She stood up straight, and for the first time in a month, she didn't look at his chin, or his coffee, or the window behind his head. She looked into his eyes. And the change was instant, and it turned Dutch's blood to slush. The dull, tired blue sharpened into something else entirely. Something with no warmth in it at all, like staring down the barrel of a loaded gun held by a hand that would not shake. No fear. No anger. just cold arithmetic. She was measuring his weight, his reach. The exact distance from her hand to his throat, every survival instinct Dutch owned stood up screaming. He didn't move a muscle. Maybe, she said, and her voice had dropped the waitress rasps.
Smooth.
Quiet, almost gentle. Maybe they met somebody more professional, maybe. He held her eyes. It cost him. But professionals leave a trail, a motive. A ghost just leaves bodies. The silence stretched, thick, suffocating. Wren reached into her apron pocket, and Dutch's heart seized. His right hand twitched toward his lapel. He remembered the flash of the curved blade. He remembered the wet sound of a man's throat coming open. Her hand came out. She set a single white paper sugar packet on the table, right next to his black coffee. Then she leaned down, her face inches from his, close enough that he could smell copper and rain under the cheap soap. You drink too much caffeine, Mr. Marlowe. Dutch stopped breathing. He had never told her his name. He had never brought a single one of his men to this place. He drove a sterile, unregistered car. He'd been careful. Careful the way a paranoid man is careful, which is to say completely. It's bad for the blood pressure, she went on. Soft, deadly, almost kind. The docks are ugly right now. Sokolov's angry. The outfit is watching your south side. A man in your position ought to be careful where he spends his nights. She knew. She had always known. For 30 days he'd thought he was the hunter, patiently studying a wounded bird. And the whole time she'd been the spider, sitting still in the center of the web, letting him walk in, watching him tie himself up in her silk, one honest tip at a time. Who are you? It was barely a breath. I'm the waitress who pours your coffee. She straightened up. The mask slammed back down, shoulders slumped, eyes went dull and tired. Drink your coffee, Mr. Marlowe. Leave your tip. Go home. She picked up the pot, turned her back, started to walk away, then stopped. Didn't turn around. And don't follow me down any more alleys. A beat. The next time you step out from behind a wall. I won't stop to see who it is. Her cheap rubber soles squeaked softly across the linoleum. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her. Dutch Marlowe sat alone in the cracked vinyl booth. His heart slammed against his ribs like something trying to get out. The man who'd burned 3 rival crews to the ground, who commanded a small army of the hardest men in the Midwest, who hadn't felt real fear since he was a boy, trembling. Over a paper packet of sugar, he didn't touch the coffee. He reached into his coat, pulled out a crisp 100, slid it under the saucer, stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and walked out into the rain. She wasn't an addict. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a lost girl who reminded him of another lost girl. She was a weapon. And somewhere in the dark machinery of this city, that weapon had been pointed. He didn't know at what yet. He didn't know why she'd stayed. He didn't know what was on the little black drive she'd pulled off a dying man in the rain. But he knew one thing, standing on the wet sidewalk with the neon buzzing over his head. He wasn't going to be able to walk away from this. He was afraid of how much he needed to know what happened next. 7 days. That was how long Dutch Marlowe stayed away from the grease-stained windows of that diner. 7 days of staring at ledgers that made notes. 7 days of bourbon that didn't touch him anymore. 7 days of snapping at Sal over nothing, at Ozzy over less, at the quiet men who guarded his doors and had learned to stop making eye contact. He buried himself in the machinery of the empire. Because that's what a man does when he doesn't want to think. He works. He took meetings in the back rooms of strip clubs and betting parlors. He moved product, collected debts. He was, by every measure that mattered in his world, a king doing king's work, and every single time he closed his eyes. A single white sugar packet. Sitting beside a black cup of coffee, the city was boiling. He could feel it through the soles of his shoes. Sokolov had turned the north side into a war zone looking for the ghost who'd butchered his men. The Russian was bleeding money and bleeding pride, and a man like that doesn't stop until he finds someone to bleed back. The cops were looking the other way so hard they were getting neck cramps. Everybody could feel it coming. The way you feel a storm in your knees before the sky goes green. On the 8th day, Dutch broke, not toward the diner. Toward the answer because he couldn't stand it. The not knowing. It itched under his skin like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He'd spent his whole life as the man who knew things, and a waitress had made him the man who didn't. And that was a thing Dutch Marlowe simply could not live with, so he did what he did best. He went hunting. Sit down, he told Ozzy. Ozzy sat, nervous. He'd been nervous since the glass, the drive. The one the Russians came to buy in the alley. She took it off the body. It's the reason 2 of Sokolov's men are in the ground and the reason he's tearing my city apart. So it matters. And I want to know why. Boss, you told me to forget the alley. I changed my mind. Ozzy ran a hand through greasy hair. I can't pull a drive I don't have. But, he hesitated, the buy. Sokolov didn't set that up on his own turf. He used a broker, a middleman. If I can find the broker, I can maybe find what was for sale, then find the broker. That's gonna cost. I don't care what it costs. Ozzy looked at him. Really looked, and whatever he saw made him nod slow and get up and leave without another word. Because here's what nobody understood yet. Not Ozzy. Not Sal. Not Dutch himself, if he was honest. This had stopped being about a woman, and started being about a man who had spent 20 years building a wall around the last soft thing left in him. And a stranger had walked up to that wall and set a packet of sugar on top of it and walked away, and now he had to know why. Sokolov called the sit-down for the next night neutral ground, a shuttered meatpacking plant out by the water. The kind of place where the Walsels had seen enough blood not to notice a little more. He's bringing an army, boss, Sal said from the front seat, big hands tight on the wheel. Rain hammering the windshield, smearing the city into streaks of dirty red and blue. My scouts count 20 men on the perimeter. Rifles. Heavy vests. This isn't a talk. This is a show. Let him show, Dutch said, watching the water run down the glass. Sokolov's a bear in a trap. He roars loudest when he's already bleeding, and if he decides we set the trap, a pause. Then we don't leave that plant. He checked the magazine on his sidearm by touch alone. Slid it home. He didn't feel the old cold adrenaline that used to come before a thing like this. He just felt hollow. The sedan rolled to a stop outside the rusted loading docks. 4 of Sokolov's men stood in the downpour, submachine guns slung across their chests, water dripping off the barrels. Keep it warm, Dutch told Sal, and stepped out into the rain. He walked past the guards without a glance, because a man who looks at the guns is a man who's afraid of them. And Dutch Marlowe had learned long ago that the trick to walking through a room full of men who want you dead is to walk like you, own the deed to the room, and the men and the guns and their mothers. Inside, the plant smelled of old iron and ammonia and wet concrete. 1 flood lamp lit a folding table in the middle of the kill floor. Everything beyond it was black. Viktor Sokolov sat at the table, a mountain of a man, late 50s. A face carved up by a hard life in harder places, the scars white against skin gone gray. Heavy wool coat, massive hands flat on the metal. 6 more men stood in the dark behind him. Dutch walked to the table and stood. He didn't sit. Sitting was a concession, and he had no plans to stay. You look tired, Marlowe. Sokolov's voice was a deep, guttural scrape that bounced off the high ceiling. You look careless, Viktor. 20 men for a conversation. You must be terrified. The Russian's eyes narrowed to dark slits. 2 of my best earners. Butchered in your territory. Cut open like hogs. And you offer me nothing but silence. They were in my territory without my permission. Dutch kept his voice flat. If my men had done it, you wouldn't have found bodies. You'd have found ashes. Whatever took your people apart, Viktor? It wasn't mine. Sokolov slammed a fist onto the table. The metal rang like a bell. Do not play games with me. They were not making a drug run. They were buying a drive, and there it was. Dutch kept his face still as stone, but behind it, the pieces slammed together so hard he almost heard them. A drive, Dutch said. Careful. Neutral. What's on it? Sokolov studied him, weighing whether to answer, whether Dutch already knew. Deciding finally that a frightened man tells the truth to see if it frightens the other man too. Names, Sokolov said. Places. A ledger. My whole northern operation, Marlowe. Every safe house. Every account. And his jaw worked. Something worse than your whole book? Sokolov didn't say what. And Dutch didn't push. Because a man doesn't rush a bear that's finally started talking. Somebody sold it out from under me. Sokolov went on, low now, deadly. My own broker. A rat inside my own house. He put the drive on the market. My men went to buy it back before it could bury me. And your ghost, his hand closed into a fist the size of a Christmas ham. Your ghost took it off my dead man's body. So the drive is gone. The seller is dead. My men are dead. And the thing that can end me is walking around this city in somebody's pocket. Dutch stood very still. Because he was thinking about a woman kneeling in the rain over a dying man. Digging through a leather coat. Coming out with something small and black. And slipping it away like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. She hadn't killed those men to protect herself. It was a job, a retrieval, a hit with a purpose. If you are sheltering the ghost who did this, Marlowe, Sokolov said, rising now, his sheer size blotting out the flood a lamp, I will burn your tower to the ground. I will kill every man who takes $1 from you. Are you finished? Sokolov paused, veins pulsing in that thick neck. Because if you're finished, Dutch said, and his voice dropped, cold and absolute, the voice that made grown men find religion. You can pack up your rifles and get out of my city. You lost your book because you sent 2 clumsy amateurs into a dark alley to do a professional's work. Find your ghost, Victor. But if you cross into my ground again with your guns out, I won't send a man. I'll come myself, and you will not see me coming. He turned his back on the Russian boss and walked toward the door. He didn't check whether the guns came up. He knew they wouldn't. Not yet. Sokolov was too scared of what he didn't understand to pull a trigger in the dark. Dutch stepped back out into the rain and got in the car. Drive, he said. Sal peeled away from the docks. How'd it go? He's lost something that can end him. And he's terrified. Dutch leaned his head back and stared at the roof, which means he's dangerous. Terrified men don't calculate. They just burn things down, but that wasn't what was eating him. What was eating him was this. A woman living in a rotting apartment, working a $2 tip job at 2 in the morning, pouring bad coffee for truckers, had a drive in her pocket that could bring down a Russian syndicate. If she wanted money, she'd have sold it back to Sokolov and been sitting on a beach somewhere warm by now. If she wanted to run, she'd have run. But she hadn't. She'd stayed, in his city, in that diner, 2 blocks from where it all went down. Which meant she wasn't done. Take me to the diner, Dutch said. Sal's eyes flicked to the mirror. Boss, it's 3 in the morning, and Sokolov's looking for any excuse to light the match. The diner, Sal. The drive took 20 minutes. The rain came down harder, and when they pulled up to the curb across from the diner, Dutch felt his stomach drop through the floor of the car. The neon was dark. The windows were black. Wait here. He crossed the street, rain soaking through his coat in seconds. He walked up to the glass door and cupped his hands and peered in, chairs stacked on tables. Coffee pots empty and washed and turned upside down to dry. He looked down at the handle. A heavy steel padlock hung from the latch, wrapped in a thick chain, and taped to the inside of the glass. A sheet of cheap, lined notebook paper for repairs. The handwriting was neat, sharp, and completely without personality. The handwriting of someone who'd been trained to leave nothing of themselves in anything they touched. She was gone. The spider had packed up her web and vanished into the dark. Dutch stood in the rain a long time, longer than made any sense. The cold worked its way into his bones and he let it. He should have felt relief. This was the smart outcome. The complication had erased itself. He could go back to his empire and his ledgers and his quiet, brutal, echoing life. Instead, the silence of the city felt heavier than it had ever felt. It didn't feel like peace, it felt like a grave. He got back in the car. Didn't speak, Saul wisely. Didn't either. Ozzy called at noon. Found your broker, he said, and his voice was doing the rattled thing again. Talk, guy named Petrov. Data fence. Sold to everybody. Sokolov, the outfit, the Poles, whoever paid. Only thing is, a pause. He's dead. Somebody put 2 in the back of his head about 3 weeks back, right before the alley. Cleaned him out. Servers wiped, so it's a dead end, it was. Except Petrov was paranoid. He kept a shadow archive, off-site. A backup nobody knew about except him. And me. Because I'm better than him, Ozzy almost sounded proud, and then he didn't. Boss, I got into it. I saw what was on the drive Sokolov was buying back. Say it. Silence on the line. Long enough that Dutch thought the call had dropped. Ozzy. It's not a ledger, Dutch. Barely a whisper now. I mean, it's got the ledger on it. But that's not the point of it. That's not what it's for. Then what is it for? It's a manifest. A what? A shipping manifest. Names. Ages. Photographs. Dutch. Ozzy's voice cracked. Sokolov's not just running money and product up from the south. He's running people. He brings them in through the ports, holds them somewhere, and moves them on to buyers. Men who pay. And the drive, a breath. The drive is the list. Every person he's got. Everyone he's moved. Everyone he's still holding right now. Today, somewhere in this city, Dutch didn't say anything. He couldn't, because a very old drawer in the back of his skull had just come open. The one with teeth. And for a moment he couldn't breathe around what was inside it. How many, he finally said, on the current hold list? 40. Boss, some of them are. Ozzy stopped himself. Started again. Some of them have been on the list a long time. Years. Held. Not sold. Just kept. Dutch closed his eyes. He thought about a woman with bruised hands who'd trained herself into a weapon, who lived under a dead child's name, who'd killed 2 men in the rain to pull a specific black drive off a specific dying body, and then stayed, in the city, waiting, not for money for someone, Ozzy. The people who've been held the longest, on that list. I want their names. And I want you to cross everyone against missing persons reports going back 10 years, he paused. Start with women, young women. Taken as girls, a long silence. You think she's on it, Ozzy said. No. Dutch opened his eyes and looked out at his gray city. I think somebody she loves is. The phantom had a heart after all. And Dutch Marlowe had just found where she kept it. The list came through at 4 a.m. Mozzie sent it encrypted, then called to walk him through it, and his voice was gray with exhaustion and something worse. Cross-referenced everything, he said. Held longest, matched against missing persons. Gotta hit that'll, he stopped. Just look at line 9, Dutch scrolled. Line 9, a photograph, grainy. A young girl, 14, maybe 15, blonde hair, and a face he knew because it was Ren's face, younger, softer, not yet carved down to the bone by whatever the years had done, but the same eyes. The same jaw, except it wasn't Ren. The manifest name's a code, Ozzy said quietly. But I ran the photo through missing persons anyway. Girl went missing 11 years ago, small town, upstate. 16 at the time, reported by her older sister. The sister, Dutch. The sister filed for 3 years, wrote letters, called the FBI, called everybody, and then a pause, and then she just stopped, disappeared from every record. Like she stepped off the edge of the world, because she did, Dutch said softly. She went and got the training, she built the weapon, and she started hunting. You want the sister's name from the old reports? No. Dutch stared at the photograph. It doesn't matter what name she had. She burned it a long time ago. He was quiet a moment. What matters is she's got a sister on Sokolov's list, and that sister is still on the current hold. Which means she's still alive, Ozzy breathed. The kid, she's alive. Right now, somewhere Sokolov's holding her, and Ren knows it. The whole thing turned over in Dutch's head, clean and terrible and finally making sense. The waitress job 2 blocks from the alley. The drive. The staying. Because the drive wasn't the prize. The drive was the map. The thing that would tell her exactly where Sokolov was keeping the one person left in the world she loved. She hadn't extracted yet because she couldn't. Because the location was encrypted. Because she still needed one more piece. She wasn't running. She was closing in. Dutch stood up. And for the first time in 8 days, the hollow feeling in his chest was gone. Something had moved in to fill it. Something hot and old and clean, Ozzy. Find her, and then the world caught fire before anyone could find anybody. Because Sokolov didn't wait. Because terrified men don't calculate, they burn things down. Dutch had said it himself in the car, and then, like a fool, had forgotten his own words. It happened on the ramp to the interstate. 4:15 in the morning. The highway a desolate stretch of wet black concrete, empty except for Dutch's Arnford sedan and the storm. Dutch was in the back, staring out the window. His mind still standing in front of that padlocked diner door, still looking at a young girl's photograph, when the flatbed tow truck pulled out of the emergency lane and blocked the ramp entirely. Sal stood on the brakes. The heavy car fishtailed, tires screaming on wet asphalt, and slammed into the guardrail with a bone-deep crunch. The side airbags didn't deploy. Glancing impact. Wrong angle ambush, Sal roared, already throwing it into reverse, and headlights bloomed in the rear window. A reinforced SUV. It smashed into their back bumper, pinning them against the rail and the flatbed. Boxed in. Perfect. Dutch didn't panic. Panic is a luxury. It's for men who don't know what comes next. Dutch always knew what came next. He drew his sidearm, kicked his door open, using the heavy armored steel as a shield, and the night came apart at the seams. Automatic fire tore through the rain. Rounds hammered the ballistic glass, spiderwebbing it white with each impact. Muzzle flashes strobed the dark from 3 directions. Sokolov, Sal shouted over the din, drawing his own pistol and firing from the driver's side. They tracked us from the plant, keep them pinned. Dutch leaned around the edge of the door, counted 6 shooters, tactical gear, suppressed rifles, moving in a slow coordinated fan to catch the car in a crossfire. These weren't street thugs with borrowed guns. These were professionals, imported muscle. Men Sokolov had flown in for exactly this. A round sparked off the roof an inch from Dutch's ear, showering him with hot metal. He ducked. And the adrenaline finally came, sharp and clean, sharpening the edges of the world. He popped up, fired 3 fast rounds at a muzzle flash near the flatbed, dropped back down, heard a wet thud, a groan. One down, but the fire didn't slow. Sal, we can't hold this, I know it. Sal fired twice. Then a heavy round punched through the gap in the open door and caught him high in the shoulder. The big man grunted, dropped his gun, clutched the wound, blood black in the strobing light. Sal, I'm hit. Right side can't. Dutch reached across the console, grabbed Sal by the collar, hauled him down below the dash. Stay down. You hear me? Stay down. He was outgunned, outflanked. And Dutch Marlowe knew the arithmetic of a firefight better than any man alive. In 60 seconds, they'd finished the flanking maneuver, put a rifle through a shattered window, and it would be over. 20 years of empire ending on a wet off-ramp, boxed in by a tow truck, next to a bleeding friend. He thought absurdly of the sugar packet. And then something changed in the rhythm of the guns. Not a slowing, a break. A sharp, chaotic tearing in the pattern. Somebody screamed. Not Sal. A high, cut short shriek from the far flank that ended in a wet crunch. Dutch raised his head, peered through the spider-webbed glass. And through the distortion and the rain, he saw a shadow moving behind the flatbed. Too fast, impossibly fast. One of the shooters, a man laying down, suppressing fire from the left, jerked violently backward, his rifle clattering to the pavement. A figure in black tactical gear and a dark rain jacket had materialized out of the darkness behind him. An arm wrapped over the soldier's face, a glint of steel, and the man went limp. His throat opened with that same surgical certainty Dutch had seen in the alley. The others realized their flank was gone. 2 pivoted, swinging rifles towards the dark. The figure didn't retreat. She dropped low, slid across the wet asphalt like water, finding the lowest ground, and as the rifles barked into empty air where she'd just been, she closed the distance. No gun, just momentum. She slammed into the knees of the first shooter and took him down hard, and before he could scream, a combat boot came down on his throat. The last 2 panicked, forgot all about the car, forgot Dutch, turned everything they had on the demon tearing through their line. And Dutch didn't waste it. He kicked his door wide, rose up, put 2 rounds center mass into the nearest shooter. The man folded, the final one spun, caught eye between Dutch and the shadow, not knowing which death to face. He chose wrong. He raised his rifle toward the figure rising from the pavement. A suppressed pistol coughed 3 times from the dark. Chest. Bridge of the nose. He crumpled against the SUV's tire, dead before gravity finished with him. And then silence, just the hiss of the rain and the tick of cooling engine blocks. And Sal's ragged breathing from the floor of the car. Dutch stepped out, glass and spent brass crunching under his shoes. The figure stood 20 feet away, lit by the trapped headlights. Breathing hard, the black jacket slick with rain and worse. She lowered her pistol, let it hang at her side, and reached up, and pulled back the soaked hood, blonde hair plastered to her skull. A face pale and empty of everything, except the cold, burning intelligence in those blue eyes. Wren. She looked at the bodies scattered across the ramp. Then she looked at Dutch. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like something older than war, standing in the wreckage of a smaller mortal thing. Dutch lowered his gun. Slow, you're closed for repairs, he said, which was, he knew, completely inadequate. But it was what came out. Wren walked toward him, stepped over the man she'd gutted like he was a puddle, stopped 5 feet away, and up close Dutch saw it. A shallow cut along her cheekbone, bleeding freely into the rain. She was bleeding. The realization hit him with a strange physical weight. She wasn't a machine. She wasn't a myth. She bled. Same red as everybody. You're an idiot, Marlowe, she said, her voice harsh, stripped raw. You let him bait you to the plant. You let him track you home. You made yourself the easiest target in this city. Then why, Dutch said, his voice steadier than his hands. Did you just save my life? She looked past him, checking the tree line, the overpass, the dark. Her eyes never stopped moving. I didn't do it for you. Sokolov thinks you have the drive. If he kills you, your organization shatters. The outfit moves in, the Poles move in. It becomes a bloodbath. The bloodbath brings the FBI, and that ruins my window. I've got days, Marlowe, maybe less. I can't have the whole city on fire while I do the one thing I came here to do. And what's that? He held her eyes. What did you come here to do? She was quiet. And then she looked back at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, something moved in her face, a crack in the ice. It's not money on that drive, she said softly. I know what everyone thinks. Russian bank accounts. A payday, a bitter, joyless smile. It was the first real expression he'd ever seen on her. I'd let him keep every dirty dollar. Then what? She didn't answer. A groan came from the car. Sal, shifting. Wren's eyes flicked to him, assessed. Dismissed. Your man's bleeding out, she said. And the highway sensors picked up the crash. Cops are 8 minutes out. The car's dead. You're not driving it anywhere. We take the SUV. She stepped over to the last man she'd shot, reached into his vest, came out with a set of keys, tossed them. Dutch caught them out of the air. Then she made a decision he could see happening behind her eyes. My extraction's compromised. After tonight, Sokolov locks down every port, every airfield, every road out of this city. Which means I can't move. And I can't finish this if I can't move. She looked at him steady. You control the shipping, the docks. You've got the one thing in this city I need and can't get anywhere else. I keep you alive tonight, and you get me what I need, and then you get me out. It wasn't a request. It was a transaction. The same flat currency she'd always dealt in. Dutch looked at the keys in his hand. Then at the ghost standing in the rain, bleeding from her cheek, 5 feet away, more alone than any human being he'd ever seen. And he thought about line 9, and a drawer with teeth. And he decided, for now, to keep both of them shut. There's a clinic, he said instead. Underground. For Sal. We go there first. You've got a cut that needs closing. Then we talk about the rest. Wren studied him. Looking for the trick, the angle, the catch. She'd spent her whole life around men who only ever offered a thing so they could take 2 things back. She didn't find it, which seemed to unsettle her more than anything. Deal, she said. And Dutch Marlowe, dragging his bleeding friend toward a dead man's SUV, with an assassin covering his back, understood one terrible and clarifying thing. He didn't want this night to end. Because for the first time in longer than he could name, he had a reason. Not an empire to defend, not a debt to collect, not a wall to keep standing, a person to protect. The clinic sat beneath a shuttered veterinary practice on the industrial edge of the city, a place where bullet holes got treated cash only and question-free. It smelled of bleach and copper and cheap rubbing alcohol. Sal lay on a stainless steel table, chest rising and falling in shallow drags. Doc Marin, a surgeon who'd lost his license to a bottle and his savings to the horses, and now owed the Marlowe family more than he'd ever repay, dug the hollow point out of Sal's shoulder with hands that shook everywhere except the part that mattered. Dutch stood by the door, his suit ruined, heavy with rain and his friend's blood. He watched Marin work with a face like poured concrete, but his eyes never left the corner of the room. Where Wren sat, she'd stripped off the soaked jacket. Underneath, a black compression shirt clung to a torso that was all lean muscle and old bruises, a roadmap of a life spent taking hits and getting back up. She wasn't watching Sal. She was watching a small mirror bolted to the wall. Holding a bottle of iodine and a curved surgical needle threaded with black silk, she poured the iodine straight into the cut on her cheek. Didn't wince. Didn't blink. Face still as carved marble. Dutch crossed the room. Let Marin do that. Marin's drunk, she threaded the needle. Steady hands, and he's busy keeping your man alive. She raised the needle to her face. Wait, he didn't decide to do it. His hand just moved, reached out, caught her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. And the instant his fingers closed around it, every muscle in her body locked. Her eyes snapped to his. The veil dropped. The apex predator surfaced, measuring, calculating, one twitch from ending him. Dutch didn't let go. He held her wrist. Just enough pressure to still it. Not enough to hurt. And he held her eyes too, which took more walking into Sokolov's plant had. 5 seconds passed. The air between them went thick. 2 killers in a bloody basement. A lifetime of violence stacked between them like cordwood. And slowly, the tension bled out of her shoulders. She loosened her grip on the needle. Dutch took it from her fingers. I've stitched half the men in my organization, he said. I know what I'm doing. Wren stared at him, and she looked tired. Not the fake, heavy exhaustion of the waitress, something deeper. A fatigue that lived in the marrow. The tiredness of someone who's been carrying something alone for so long she's forgotten it's supposed to be heavy. No anesthetic, she whispered. I need to stay sharp. I know. He leaned in. Close enough to feel the heat off her skin. Close enough to smell the rain and gunpowder in her hair. He placed his left hand gently against her jaw to steady her head. Her skin was soft, so soft. A shocking contrast to the iron underneath. He pushed the needle through the edge of the cut. Her breath hitched, a sharp pull of air through her teeth. But she didn't move. Her blue eyes stayed locked on his, unblinking. "Why didn't you just run?" Dutch asked quietly, pulling the silk tight, tying a small, precise knot. "After the alley. You had the drive. You could have been across an ocean by now." "I had to confirm the key," she said, voice strained as the needle went through again. "The thing I need, it's encrypted. I extract it wrong. It's gone forever. I needed access to Sokolov's local network to pull the sequence. And the diner sat blocks from a fiber junction that gave me a hard line into his system. No wireless, no alarms. So I stayed. I poured your coffee. I waited, and I was just a complication. You were a mob boss who developed a sudden interest in bad diner food, a ghost of that bitter smile." "Yes," Dutch snipped the thread. Wiped a bead of blood with gauze. "I didn't come for the food." Her eyes searched his face, and the hardened armor cracked again. "Just for a fraction of a second. You're a fool, Marlowe." Barely a whisper. "I don't exist. I'm a name on a stillborn's grave. You fall for a ghost. All you do is haunt yourself. Who said anything about falling?" He dropped the scissors on the metal tray, stepped back, and the sudden distance felt cold in a way he didn't examine. He turned to Marin, wrapping Sal's chest in thick white bandage. "Will he live?" "Lost a lot of blood, Mr. Marlowe." Marin wiped sweat from his brow, but the round missed the artery. "He's stable. He needs to rest here. A few days, then he rests here." Dutch looked at his old friend, gray and still on the table, and something moved in his chest that he didn't let reach his face. "You keep him breathing, Marin. He dies. I bury you under your own floor." He checked his watch. 5:30. Dawn bleeding gray into the sky. He looked back at Wren. The 3 black stitches stood out sharp against her pale cheek, and Dutch made a decision. The kind that ends one life and begins another. "Get some rest," he told her. "Because tonight..." He paused at the door. "Tonight we're not getting you out of this city. Tonight we're going to go get what you actually came here for." "And I already know what it is." She went very still, dead still. The stillness of a woman who just felt the ground shift under a secret she'd guarded with her life. "What did you say, line 9? Dutch said quietly. "She's been alive this whole time. And I know where Sokolov's list says he's keeping her." And for the first time since he'd stepped into that alley and watched a moth tear a spider in half, Dutch Marlowe watched the ghost's face come apart completely. For 11 years she had carried the secret alone, and now a mafia king had just set it on the table between them. Like a sugar packet, Wren didn't move, didn't breathe. Dutch watched something happen in her face that he'd never seen there before. Fear. Not fear of him, not fear of dying. She'd made peace with dying a long time ago, he could tell. This was older, deeper. The specific terror of a person who's held one thing so tight for so long that the thought of someone else touching it feels like an amputation. "Say her name," Wren said. Her voice barely there. "I don't know her name." Dutch stayed by the door, kept his distance. "Because you don't crowd a cornered animal. I know she's on Sokolov's manifest. Line 9, missing 11 years, 16 years old, small town upstate. I know a sister filed reports for 3 years and then vanished off the face of the earth." He paused. "Because that sister went and became something that could go get her back." Wren's hands curled into fists on her knees. "You don't get to have this." Her voice cracked down the middle. "You don't get to know about her. She's not part of your world. Your world is what took her, and there it was. The thing under everything." "You're right," Dutch said quietly. "My world is exactly what took her. Men like me, men like Sokolov. We built them and ate her. So maybe," he looked at his own hands, blood dried in the creases, "maybe a man like me is exactly what you need to break it." Silence. Long. Heavy. "Her name is Junie," Wren finally said. And the word came out of her like a stone she'd been carrying under her tongue for a decade. Junie. Just that. A soft, small, ordinary name. The name of a girl who used to exist. She was 16. I was 19. Wren stared at the floor. Our folks were already gone. It was just us. And I worked doubles so she could stay in school. And one night she didn't come home, and the police wrote it up as a runaway. Because that's what they do with poor girls from towns nobody's heard of. They write runaway. They close the file. They go home to their own kids. Dutch said nothing. Some things you don't interrupt. I looked for her 3 years the legal way. Letters, calls, begging, and it got me nothing. So I stopped being a person the legal way could see. I went somewhere that teaches you things, and I let them turn me into a tool. And for 8 years I've been working my way up to the took her. One dead trafficker at a time, following the thread. Buying names with blood, she looked up. And the thread led here. To Sokolov, to that drive, to the one manifest that would finally tell me where he's been keeping her all these years. She's alive, Marlowe, and she's 2 miles from where I've been pouring your coffee. This room was quiet except for Sal's slow breathing and the drip of the IV. Then we go get her, Dutch said. Wren laughed. Once, short and bitter and wet, you don't understand. The location's encrypted. Rotating cipher. I need Sokolov's local key to open it. That's why I stayed. That's the piece I've been trying to pull off his network. And now he's locked down the whole city looking for me. His server's a fortress. I'm out of time and out of moves, and the one door left is behind 20 armed men. You're out of moves, Dutch said. I'm not. She looked at him. You've been trying to sneak into Sokolov's house through the network, Dutch said. And something old and dangerous woke up in his voice. Quiet, careful. Alone, like a ghost. But you're not the only kind of predator in this city, Wren. Some of us don't sneak. Some of us knock the door off the hinges and walk in the front. You'd start a war. I've been at war since I was 22. A grim smile. And I just watched a Russian try to kill me on an off-ramp. He fired first, which means every rule I've been living by just went out the window. And a man with no rules and an army is a very useful thing to have. Especially for a woman who spent 11 years trying to do this all by herself. Wren stared at him. And Dutch watched her run the math. The same cold arithmetic she ran on everything. Looking for the angle, the catch, the price that always came due. Why? She said finally. And don't tell me it's about your city. Don't tell me it's about the FBI. I've been read by better liars than you and Dutch Marlowe, who had not told a true thing about his own heart to a living soul in 20 years. Told her one, because I had a daughter. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. She'd be grown now. Her mother took her and ran when she was a baby, and it was the smartest thing anybody ever did, running from me. And then a road iced over on the other side of the country, and it took them both. I found out from a lawyer, a phone call. I didn't even have the right to stand at the funeral. He looked at Wren, and he let her see it. The one thing he never let anyone see, I built all of this. The army, the tower, the name that makes grown men whisper, and I have never once, not one single day of my life, gotten to stand between someone I loved and the dark and say, not her. Not while I'm breathing, he stepped toward her. Slow, you've been carrying your sister alone for 11 years. And I've been carrying an empty crib for 6. So don't ask me why. You already know why. It's the only thing either of us has got left. Wren didn't speak, but her eyes were wet, and a single tear cut a clean line down through the dried blood on her cheek. She didn't wipe it. She didn't seem to know it was there, the ghost, the phantom. The weapon that had torn 4 professional soldiers apart on a highway ramp 2 hours ago was crying. Okay, she whispered just that. Okay. And in that one small word, 11 years of doing it alone came to an end. They had one day, because that was the window. Sokolov had a buyer coming for the drive he thought he was getting back. And beyond that, Junie's location on the manifest was set to rotate to a new safe house at dawn tomorrow. Move her, and the thread went cold again. Maybe forever, one day. To find a key, to crack a manifest, to hit a Russian syndicate on its home ground and pull a girl out of 11 years of darkness. Dutch made phone calls, the empire he'd spent 2 decades building. The machine of hard men and quiet money and favors owed in blood, he pointed all of it at one target. He didn't tell them why. He didn't have to. When Dutch Marlowe says we move tonight, men who've killed for less than a paycheck check their weapons and ask what time. You're burning everything for this, Ozzy said, watching him work. You know that. The truce. The peace you spent 10 years building. Sokolov's got friends. This won't stay in Chicago. Let it not stay in Chicago. Boss Ozzy, Dutch stopped, looked at the kid he'd pulled out of a juvenile hall a decade back, the closest thing to a son he'd let himself have. In 20 years, have I ever asked you to help me do one clean thing? One thing that wasn't about money, or power, or somebody who crossed me? Ozzy went quiet. Then let me do this one, Dutch said. Get me into Sokolov's network. Get her that key. And whatever comes after, let it come. Ozzy looked at him a long moment. Then he cracked his knuckles and turned to his screens. Give me till nightfall, he said. I'll get you your door, and then the day fell apart. Because Dutch Marlowe was not the only one who'd been keeping secrets. It was Ozzy who found it. 3 hours before the hit. Buried in the shadow archive of a dead broker, he came into Dutch's office gray-faced, and he didn't say a word. He just turned his laptop around and set it on the mahogany desk and let the screen do the talking. An E chain. And old between Viktor Sokolov and someone with a handle that made Wren go white when she saw it. That's my handler, she said. Barely a breath. That's Kestrel. The person I've been reporting to for 8 years. The person who's supposed to take the drive when this is done. The person who's supposed to get Junie extracted to safety. Read the dates, Ozzy said quietly. She read the dates, and Dutch watched her face fall through the floor because the emails were 11 years old, because the very first message in the chain, the one that started everything, was Kestrel selling Sokolov a list of targets. Girls. From small towns, towns nobody would look too hard at, a list, for a price, and on that list, line for line was Junie? He sold her, Wren said, and her voice had gone somewhere Dutch had never heard a human voice go, the man I've been bleeding for 8 years. The man I trusted with the only thing left in the world I love. He's the one who put her on the truck. The reason she was ever taken at all. The room was so quiet, Dutch could hear the city breathing outside the glass. And he's still working it, Ozzy said, gentle as he could. Boss, Wren. Kestrel doesn't want the drive to rescue anybody. He wants it because his name's on it. 11 years of selling girls to Sokolov. It's all on that manifest. He's not your handler. He's Sokolov's partner. He's been running you like a dog, sending you up the chain to clean up loose ends. Because a dead trafficker is a dead witness. You've been doing his housekeeping for 8 years and calling it justice. Wren sat down. She just sat down in the chair by the window, like her legs had stopped agreeing to hold her. 11 years. A whole life poured out drop by drop into a search. A self burned down to bone and muscle and a curved little blade. And the hand she'd been reporting to. Trusting. The one voices in the dark she'd believed was on her side. Had been the hand that started it all. Wren. Dutch crossed the room. Knelt in front of her chair so his eyes were below hers, so she'd know she still held the high ground. Look at me. She looked at him, and her eyes were empty, in a way that scared him more than any gun ever had. Everything I did, she whispered. Every man I killed. I thought I was climbing toward her. I thought each one got me closer, and I was just. She shook her head. I was just cleaning up after the man who took her. I've been his weapon, not my own. Dutch took her hands, both of them, held them in his, and they were cold, and they were the hardest hands he'd ever touched, and they were shaking. Listen to me. Because I know something about being a weapon somebody else built. About waking up one day and finding out your whole life served a machine you hated. I know exactly what that feels like, then you know it's over. Whatever I do now, it doesn't undo. It's not over, Dutch's grip tightened. It's not over because Junie is still alive. Everything before this second is his story. Fine, let it be his. But what happens tonight? He leaned in. What happens tonight is yours. You take the thing he built and you turn it on him. You use 11 years of his weapon to burn his whole house down and pull your sister out of the fire. That's not being his tool, Wren. That's the tool turning in the hand. That's the last thing a man like that ever expects. And slowly something came back into her eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Something colder and cleaner and more useful warmth. Purpose. He'll be there tonight, she said. Kestrel. When Sokolov moves the drive, when he moves Junie, the handoff, Kestrel handles the extraction personally. He always has. He'll be there to make sure the loose ends get tied off. Including me. Especially me. Good, Dutch said, and rose to his feet, and offered her his hand. Then tonight we tie off some loose ends of our own. She looked at his hand, and she took it. And the ghost stood up, out of the chair a different thing than she'd sat down in it. Sokolov moved the girl at the docks, because of course he did. Because the ports were the only clean way out of the city, and Sokolov owned piers 12 through 18, and a man moves his cargo the way he's always moved it. Through the doors he's always used. But Dutch owned Pier 42. And Dutch owned the harbor master. And Dutch owned the men who worked the cranes and the trucks in the deep water. And Dutch had spent 20 years making sure that when he needed the docks to go quiet and blind, they went quiet and blind. The fog came in off the lake near midnight, thick, wet, turning the forest of shipping containers into a gray labyrinth where a man could disappear inside of 10 feet. It was perfect cover. For everybody. Here's how it goes wrong, Wren said, low, as they moved between the container stacks. She wore the black tactical gear now, the curved blade at her hip, a suppressed rifle across her chest. She moved like the fog itself. Kestrel knows me, knows how I work, knows I'm coming. So whatever plan we think we have, he's already got a counter. Then we don't have a plan, Dutch murmured. We have three Sokolov's men, Kestrel's men, and whatever surprise Kestrel's cooked up for you specifically. 3 fights. Maybe at once he checked the load on his pistol. You take Kestrel, he's yours. That debt is yours to collect, not mine. And Junie, he looked at her. You point me at where they're holding her and I get her out. That's my job tonight. That's the whole reason I'm breathing tonight. You go settle your account. I get the girl. Wren stopped in the fog, turned to him, and in the gray dark her eyes found his. Why does it have to be you who gets her? Because you'll have your hands full, Dutch said. And because, he paused, and just once more to tell the truth. Because I've waited my whole life to walk a frightened kid out of the dark and put her somewhere safe. Don't take that from me, Wren. It's the only inheritance I've got to leave. She held his eyes a second longer, then she nodded. Once. And they went to war. It came apart exactly the way Wren said it would, because Kestrel had planned for her. They hit Sokolov's men first at the container yard by Pier 15, and for 90 seconds it went clean. Dutch's people were good, quiet, professional. They took the outer guards in the fog before the Russians knew the fog had teeth, and then the trap sprung, floodlights blazed on from 3 directions, pinning them in white light. And a voice came over a loudspeaker, calm, amused, American. A voice Wren knew in her bones. Kestrel, you brought friends, little bird, the voice said, echoing off the steel. I'm almost proud. 8 years I pointed you at everyone who could hurt me, and you never once thought to point yourself at me. And now, at the very end, you finally figure it out, and you show up with a mob boss and his errand boys. It won't be enough. It was never going to be enough. You were only ever as good as the leash I let you run on. Gunfire tore through the fog. But it didn't come from where Dutch expected. Because Kestrel hadn't set his men to fight Dutch's crew head-on. He'd set them to isolate Wren, to cut her out of the herd. To finish the one loose end that could hang him, and it worked. In the chaos and the light and the fog, Dutch lost sight of her. Wren, nothing. Just muzzle flash and the scream of ricochets off steel. And this is the moment where Dutch Marlowe had to make the choice that would define whether he was the man he'd spent his whole life being. Or the man he'd decided, hours ago, to become. Because every instinct screamed to go after her. To protect her. To be the wall, but she didn't need a wall. She'd never needed a wall. She was the deadliest thing in this fog, and both of them knew it. What she needed was for him to trust her. And do his job, Junie, Dutch said out loud to himself in the roar. Get the girl, and he turned away from the woman he wanted to save, and ran toward the one he'd promised to. The manifest said Pier 14, a shipping container, refrigerated unit, tucked in the back of a stack Sokolov used for the cargo he didn't want found. Ozzy had cracked the location an hour before the hit, the last gift of a dead broker's shadow archive. Dutch cut through the fog with 2 of his men, took out a guard at the mouth of the stack, took out another at the container line, and then he was standing in front of a rust-streaked steel box with a heavy padlock and a small, barred vent near the top. And he heard it breathing. Inside. Fast and scared. Junie, Dutch said low through the steel. My name's Dutch. Your sister sent me. Do you understand your sister? She's been looking for you for 11 years. And she's here, right here, and we're taking you home, silence. Then, a small, cracked, disbelieving voice. Nobody's coming. 4 words. 4 small words that broke something in Dutch's chest that had been broken a long time already, because he knew that voice. Not the girl, the despair in it. The voice of a person who stopped believing anyone is coming. He'd heard it in his own head for 6 years, in the dark, in the empty tower. Somebody's coming, Dutch said. And his own voice shook, and he didn't care. Somebody came. I'm right here. Stand back from the door, sweetheart. Cover your ears. He shot the lock and hauled the door open. And there in the dark of a refrigerated shipping container, thin and pale and blinking against the fog light, was a young woman who'd gone in a girl and never gotten to come out. 27 years old now, 11 years stolen. Line 9 on a dead man's manifest, Junie. She looked at Dutch, this stranger, this hard-faced man in a ruined suit standing in a war she couldn't see. And Dutch did the thing he'd waited his entire life to do. He took off his coat, and he wrapped it around her shoulders, and he put himself between her and the dark. And he said the words that had been sitting in his chest for 6 years with nowhere to go. Not while I'm breathing, Dutch said. You're safe now. Nobody touches you. Not while I'm breathing, and Junie, who hadn't been touched with kindness in 11 years, who'd forgotten the word safe even meant anything, started to cry, while across the yard, in the fog. The ghost was collecting a debt. Wren found Kestrel where she knew she'd find him, at the center, directing, untouchable, the way he'd always been, a lean gray man in a good coat who'd spent 11 years sending other people to die and never once bled for it himself. He turned when he heard her, and he smiled. Because he thought his men had her boxed. Because he'd always been able to think 3 moves ahead of her. Except this time she wasn't running on his leash. This time she wasn't his weapon pointed where he aimed her. This time she'd come for him. "You're supposed to be dead," Kestrel said. Still smiling, but the smile had gone thin. "Everyone keeps telling me that." She came out of the fog like the fog had decided to kill him. His 2 closest men raised their weapons, and she was already inside their reach, already moving, and the curved blade did the work it had spent 11 years learning to do. One. Then the other. Fast, clean, and then it was just the 2 of them, the handler and the weapon he'd built, in the fog, on the wet concrete. At the end of a long, long story, Kestrel drew a pistol. Wren was faster. She took the gun out of his hand the way you take a toy from a child, and she put him on his knees on the cold concrete, and she crouched down so he had to look at her. "You sold my sister," she said. Quiet, level, emptied of everything but the truth, when she was 16. And then you found me looking for her, and instead of killing me, you saw use for me. You pointed me at your own competition and let me clean your house for 8 years. You let me think I was climbing toward her. And every step was really just doing your dirty work. Kestrel's mouth opened. Some clever thing, some final manipulation. The tool he'd always used. Wren didn't let him. "She's out of that box right now," Wren said. "There's a man walking her into the light while you and I have this conversation. A man with more blood on his hands than you'll ever have. And he's a better human being than you were on your best day. Because he came to save somebody. And you," she leaned in. "You only ever came to sell." And the ghost collected her debt, in the fog. The way ghosts do, behind her, the fight was ending. Sokolov's men, leaderless because Dutch's crew had run the Russian to ground and in the confusion, and finished what the off-ramp started, broke and scattered into the gray. The floodlights died one by one. The gunfire trailed off into the hiss of the rain. And then Wren was running toward Pier 14, toward the fog light, toward a coat wrapped around a thin pair of shoulders and a hard-faced man standing guard, toward a face she hadn't seen in 11 years. She came out of the mist at a dead run, and stopped, because there she was, Junie, older, thinner. Marked by 11 years Wren would spend the rest of her life imagining, but her. Unmistakably, impossibly alive her, and for 1 second neither sister moved. Because 11 years is a long time. Because both of them had spent it believing the other was probably dead. Because the distance between them was 3 feet, and also a decade, and also everything, Junie. Wren said, and her voice broke on the single syllable of it. And Junie looked at this woman, this hard, scarred, terrifying woman in black with blood on her hands, and for a moment she didn't recognize her, because the sister she remembered had been soft, had worked doubles and laughed easy, and then she saw the eyes. The same eyes. "You came," Junie whispered. "You actually came. I never stopped." Wren crossed the 3 feet and 11 years in 2 steps and pulled her sister into her arms, and the weapon, the ghost, the phantom that didn't exist, held on to the one thing that proved she'd ever been a person at all. "I never stopped looking. Not for 1 day. Not for 1 hour. I told you I'd find you. I promised. Do you remember? I promised." And Dutch Marlowe stood a few feet away in the fog, coatless in the cold, and watched 2 sisters hold each other in the wreckage of a war he'd helped fight. And he didn't feel like a mafia boss. He didn't feel like a killer, or a king, or a name that made men whisper, for the first time in his whole gray life. He felt like a man who'd done 1 clean thing, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The dawn came up pale and cold over the water. The docks were quiet again. Dutch's people had done the necessary work in the fog and the necessary work after, and the Harmerfester had gone home blind the way he'd been paid to, and by the time the sun cracked the horizon, there was nothing left to find but empty containers and washed concrete. Sokolov's syndicate would fracture by noon. Leaderless. The manifest in Ozzy's hands now, which meant 40-some other people held in the dark across the city, would be found and freed before the week was out. Quiet tips to the right people. No names, no trail. Kestrel's operation would die with him. His network of small towns and stolen girls finally permanently closed. The drive was going to a clean contact. Ozzy had found one. Not a handler. Not an agency with a rot in it. Just a journalist. A dogged, honest, unbuyable woman who'd spent her career trying to blow the lid off exactly this. The 40-some other names on the manifest were going to see the light of day. Because Wren had decided that Junie's freedom wouldn't be the last thing that Drive ever did. That was new. Something Dutch had put in her, maybe. Or something that had always been there under 11 years of ice, waiting for a reason to come out. Junie was already aboard the freighter that would take the sisters somewhere far and warm and safe. Resting, safe. A word that meant something again, and it was just the two of them on the pier, the ghost and the king, same as it had always been. You could come, Wren said. Dutch smiled. No, I couldn't. Why not? Because I'm a 51-story man. Wren, this is my city. Even the rotten parts. Especially the rotten parts. Somebody's got to hold it, and if it's not me, it's somebody worse. He looked out at the gray water. And because you and Junie need to build something clean. And there is nothing clean about me. I'd be a bloodstain on a life you're finally getting to start over. You saved her. I got to save her, Dutch corrected softly. There's a difference. You gave me that. 11 years you carried her alone, and at the very end you let me carry her the last 100 yards. I don't have the words to tell you what that's worth to me. Wren was quiet a moment. What happens to you now? She asked. I go back up the tower. I hold the city. Yep. I do the ugly work that keeps worse men out. He shrugged. It's what I know. It's what I'm for. That's a lonely life, Marlowe. It was. He looked at her. Right up until a waitress with bruised hands read me across a room and set me down next to the sugar. And now, a real smile. The first one she'd ever seen reach his eyes. Now I know I've still got a heart in here. It works. You proved that. That's enough to go on with. A man doesn't need much. Just proof the thing still beats, the freighter's horn sounded. Deep. Long, shaking the fog off the water. Time Wren stepped close, and she reached out. And her fingers grazed the lapel of his ruined suit, where his coat used to be. The coat that was still wrapped around her sister's shoulders below deck. It was the gentlest thing he'd ever felt. A stark, impossible contrast to the violence he knew those hands could do. You shouldn't have followed me, Dutch, she said. And her voice cracked just barely, one last hairline fracture in the ice. That first night. You should have stayed home. It was the only good decision I've made in 10 years, he said. And he didn't kiss her, because a kiss belonged to a different story. A softer one. A world where they didn't both have blood under their fingernails and ghosts in their past, and cities and sisters to hold. That wasn't their story. Their story was harder and stranger and, in its own broken way, more true. So instead he just up, and he took her hand, and he pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart, and he let her feel it, the heavy, steady, stubborn rhythm of it, still going. After everything. Proof for both of them that under the empire of fear and the tailored suits and the 20 years of blood, there was a living man in there, and that living men can still, at the very end, choose to do one good thing. Wren held her hand there a moment, feeling it beat. And for 1 second, the phantom vanished entirely, and a real, tethered, human woman stared back at him with wet eyes. Then she pulled her hand away. She turned and walked up the steel gangway, her boots silent on the grating, the way she did everything. She didn't look back, because looking back wasn't in her. Because the only direction that woman had ever known how to go was forward, into the dark, after the people she loved. Except now she was walking into the light, and she was taking her sister with her. Dutch stood on the pier and watched the crew cast off the heavy lines, watched the freighter groan away from the concrete, watched the rusted hull slide inch by inch into the fog until there was nothing left but the churning white wake on the black water. And then, not even. That he drove back into the city alone as the sun came up and washed the streets clean. He went straight to the penthouse. He poured a bourbon he didn't drink, and he sat at the mahogany desk and watched his city wake up beneath him, 51 floors down, oblivious to the war that had ended in the fog before dawn. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk. Inside, next to a spare magazine and a stack of untraceable bonds, was a photograph of a gapped-toothed little girl squinting into a sun that had gone down a long time ago. For 6 years he hadn't been able to look at it. He looked at it now, a long time, and it didn't have teeth anymore. It was just his daughter, smiling. And he let himself finally smile back. Beside the photograph sat a single white paper sugar packet. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, felt the coarse grains shift inside. The diner was closed. The waitress was gone. The city was quiet. But he knew the truth about ghosts now. Sometimes, if you're very lucky, they leave a piece of themselves behind. Just to prove they were real. Just to prove the whole impossible thing actually happened. That a hollow man got to have a heart for 1 week in the rain, and got to be somebody's protection for 1 night in the fog, and got to do one clean thing in a long and bloody life. His phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. No name, just a photograph. 2 women. On the deck of a ship, somewhere with sun, somewhere warm. One of them thin and pale and healing, wrapped in a charcoal coat 3 sizes too big for her. And the other hard and scarred with an arm around her sister and something on her face Dutch had never once seen there in all their nights in the diner. She was smiling. Below the photograph, 3 words, "We made it." Dutch Marlowe looked at that picture for a long, long time. Then he set the phone down, and he picked up the sugar packet, and he put it in his breast pocket, over his heart, where he'd carry it from now on. Because the diner was closed, and the ghost was gone. But somewhere out there in the sun, 2 sisters were alive, and free. And together, and a hollow man in a tower in the gray city had, at the very end of a long and bloody life, finally gotten to be the one good thing he'd never believed he could be, and that was enough to keep a heart beating for a long time yet.